on behalf of the Middle East Institute to introduce the program today. It's called Hamas's Shifting Political Calculations. This is part of a series, an MEI series made possible by the George and Rhonda Salem Family Foundation. And we're lucky to have three preeminent experts on Hamas and other things as well with us today. Rob Malley is the lawyer, author, analyst. He's the director of the International Crisis Group's Middle East and North Africa staff. He has, I think, unmatched experience in the U.S. government peacemaking diplomacy between Israel and Palestine, having served on the NSC staff from 96 to 98, and then from 98 to 2001 as a special assistant to President Clinton. He was deeply involved in the Oslo peace process. Many will remember Rob because of his, I think by now, classic analyses in the New York Review of Books on what went wrong during the Oslo years with his co-author Hussein Al-Agha. Ghaith al-Omari on the far left is the executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine. Ghaith, too, is a peacemaker, having served President Mahmoud Abbas, Palestinian Authority, having been a very close and much involved advisor to the Palestinian team in Oslo, especially during the latter years. He was with the process right up through the end at Taba, and he later was the lead Palestinian drafter of the Geneva Accords. Mark Perry is a seasoned foreign policy analyst. He has written on intelligence, military affairs, and I think has an unrivaled insight into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and particularly the Palestinian political side of it, Hamas. He's a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, The Nation, the LA Times. He's a several times published author. You all know that in 2006, the Islamist element in Palestinian politics, by then more or less a political party, ran, although it didn't run under its own name, in the Palestinian parliamentary election. To everyone's surprise, they won a plurality in that election, thrusting them into a leadership position they hadn't really expected. Promptly, the United States, which had promoted democratic elections as the way to a breakthrough in the Middle East, said it would not deal with the new Hamas government because of Hamas's past involvement in terrorism. And then, as did the Israeli government, there were various efforts to create a workable coalition with some help from the Arab states, but it foundered when Hamas clashed in a military exchange in Gaza, which was, at least implicitly, abetted by the United States, and the two parts of Palestine split geographically and politically. In May of 2011, after the breakout of the Arab awakening, Egypt brokered a new national unity of government. It was an outline to be implemented between the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas leadership in Gaza. That led to a series of high-level exchanges and a fleshing out of the outline, commitment to ultimate elections and a Palestinian admission to the PLO. It didn't work. The exchanges continue, but the prospect of real unity, bringing back together the two Palestinian factions, seems pretty distant. Well, Today, rather than having individual lectures by our three panelists, we'd like to have a discussion. We'll take maybe a little bit less than an hour and then leave an hour for half an hour at most for comments, questions from the audience. So thank you all for coming. I want to start, if we can, with a discussion of the impact of the Arab awakening and the changes in regional politics that has brought about. Hamas's relationship with Syria and Iran and its other supporters in Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood and its other regional relations. And I'm going to ask Rob Malley if he could comment on that, and then the others will offer their thoughts. Rob?
Thank you, Phil. First, I want to say thanks for all of you coming here on a day where it's about to storm, and also, given what seems to be the rapidly declining interest in the anything having to do with the Israelis and Palestinians, the fact that so many are here when I could barely keep my family awake when I talk about it, I think it says something, and it's always gratifying. Let me just set a little bit of background on where Hamas was at the time when I'm not sure what to call it. We call it the Arab Spring, but it's all 4 seasons rolled into one. Maybe you should call it the Arab version of climate change. And before what happened in Egypt, Tunisia happened. Here was a movement that really was stuck in many ways, and Hamas officials who I met with were quite openly recognizing it. I mean, they were stuck in Gaza. They were victims of a dual siege, one by Israel, the other by Israel. There were no real prospects for reconciliation for all kinds of reasons, some having to do with Hamas, others with Fatah, and many having to do with the international community. The takeover in Gaza had raised all kinds of issues for the movement. It was accused by some of giving up some of its ideological tenets for the sake of operating as a regime that in many ways replicated the kinds of regimes one saw in other parts of the region. So it was sacrificing its ideology of resistance by cracking down in the same way that Fatah used to crack down against Hamas when it would launch rockets, by cracking down on some religious groups, and was facing some significant discontent domestically because it really wasn't able to manage the task of governance, again, to a large extent due to the siege and due to the attitude of others, but also due to its own incompetence. So the events in Egypt, what I call sort of the wedding in Cairo, what they saw in Egypt, was in many ways an opening and an opportunity that Hamas was waiting for and that it grabbed with relish. It saw it as vindication of its view that Arab public opinion was its salvation, that the regimes were beholden to the U.S. and to Israel, and that public opinion was revolting in its eyes, largely because of the subservience of these regimes to a Western agenda. It saw its main parent organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, coming to power not just in Egypt, but in Tunisia, in Morocco, perhaps in Libya, elsewhere, and therefore seeing that it would have allies where beforehand it had at best lukewarm acquaintances and in many cases enemies. It saw the possibility of opening up Rafah. It saw the possibility of Egypt becoming a very different kind of mediator, not just between Israelis and Palestinians, but among Palestinians themselves, between Fatah and Hamas. So basically, it saw the kind of opening that it was waiting for. That was followed by, I guess we could call it the funeral in Damascus, which raised all kinds of different questions for an organization that was torn between feelings of loyalty towards a regime that had hosted it and helped it for a very long time when nobody else was prepared to do it other than Iran, that it proved loyal and provided assistance at times when Hamas needed it, and it was part of the axis of resistance to which Hamas belonged. But at the same time, it was very difficult for a Sunni Islamist organization to stand with a secular Alawite regime that was repressing a Sunni population, at the cost, perhaps, risking its relationship with the future Syria in the event the uprising were to succeed, jeopardizing its relations with Arab countries, with Sunni Arab countries with which it would want to be closer, and in particular jeopardizing perhaps its relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood was a banned organization in Syria. Membership in the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood is a crime that can bring the death penalty, and so it was very difficult for Hamas, even though it tried at the beginning to be neutral in the conflict between the regime and the opposition, to stay in that stance for a very long time. But that did mean real questioning of a number of the basis of support of the regime, material basis of support, diplomatic, political. And so, as I said, the good news of Egypt was somewhat clouded by the bad news in Damascus. I don't want to take too much time. I just want to sort of set that context and say that I think as a result of what's happened in the Arab Spring, in the Arab uprisings, issues that had been debated within Hamas, but which Hamas had eluded and had been able to sort of be ambivalent about for some time, its position towards resistance, its position towards 1967, its position towards reconciliation, its position towards negotiations with Israel, its regional alliances, those questions have become sharpened. I think this is a theme one sees throughout the world. All actors, entities, because of what's happened in the Arab Spring, have had to be clearer. We were coming out with a report Monday on the peace process, and the title is "The Emperor Has No Clothes." The point being, people can't stay in the ambiguous position they stayed in before, and that has sharpened the debate within Hamas, and we'll come in, I'm sure we'll get into the internal divisions with Hamas, with different views of what the Arab Spring means for Hamas, different views about, and just to put it very, very schematically, one view which says the Arab Spring is a moment where our allies, the Muslim Brotherhood, are going to be in power virtually everywhere, including in Syria at some point. We need to jump on that bandwagon because it is our train. We need to take advantage of it. And if it means that we have to make some short-term concessions in order to be part of this new international legitimacy, just as the Muslim Brotherhood is doing everything it can to reassure the West, maybe we should as well. And that means that we're going to have to move towards reconciliation. We have to be more favorable to peaceful as opposed to popular resistance as opposed to violent resistance. We have to be more supportive of the two-state solution, because that's what the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, that's what the Qataris, that's what others want us to do. And then there's the other view, which is dictated both by self-interest but also by ideological conviction to some extent, which is, why should we, now that we finally see victory at hand, we see the region coming our way, we see popular opinion coming our way, why should this be the time when we make the concessions? We're stronger now. We have time. Let's not do what our antagonists in Fatah have always done. Whenever there's been a change, whenever they've been under stress, they've rushed to make a concession. Take our time, take a deep breath. Trends in the region are coming our way. And so those are the two, and as I say, broadly, very broadly speaking, the Mashal view being the first, the Zahar view being the second, external, internal. It's much more complicated than that, but that has also sharpened some of the debates that had preceded the Arab Spring, and I assume are going to outlast the Arab Spring about where Hamas wants to go. But I think it is now, the one lesson I would draw is that it is now confronted with the obligation to make clearer choices than it has in the past.
Thanks, Rob. Much has been made of Iranian support of Hamas, to the extent that some Israeli spokesmen have described Hamas as a tool of Tehran. Is it true that Iran provided substantial diplomatic and financial support to Hamas, and what's happened?
There's no doubt that Iran has been one of the very few. Again, I mean, this is a point that Hamas officials have made to me over the years when they say, if every day you have breakfast, lunch, and dinner with only one person because nobody else wants to deal with you, and that's really Syria and Iran, by definition you're going to be close, and you're going to be there's going to be a feeling of loyalty, and Iran has provided financial assistance. My understanding, from what I'm told by people in Gaza, was that at the beginning, when there was the tension over Syria, because it is true that the Syrian regime asked Hamas to do specific things that Hamas refused to do. There are very specific forms of help that the Syrian regime asked and that Hamas refused to give, and as we know now, the conflict is much more in the open. Iran reportedly, but I'm told this by senior people in Gaza, cut off the funding. As I understand it, they've since resumed it. Haniya made a trip to Iran, and Hamas's position is we have no problem with Iran, and we still are very close to Iran, and we are not going to make a choice between Iran and Gulf Arab states. Our problem, if we have a problem, it's with a regime in Syria that is going against the will of its people. And I think from Iran's perspective as well, they don't have any interest in cutting themselves off from what may soon be the only Sunni Arab ally they still have. So I think, I'm sure there's more tension now than there was in the past, but my sense is they're both trying to get back to a position where there's a mutual interest in maintaining the relationship.
Mark, Ghaith, would you like to comment on the impact of the regional changes in Hamas?
Sure. Thank you first of all, and to MEI for this opportunity. I would just add to what Rob said. And maybe sharpen up a couple of points. I cannot overstate how important what happened in Syria was for Hamas's calculations. Hamas's relation with Iran has always been a very problematic one, and a vulnerability to some extent to Hamas. I don't know if some of you remember when Saddam Hussein was executed. There was a number of graffiti and articles or what have you accusing Hamas of being a Shiite agent. And in that regard, for a Sunni organization, this relationship was always tense, and it was always to a large extent mediated by Syria. Syria in this regard often worked as a filter or as an interface, and with the collapse of this interface, and with Iran's role and the sectarian nature, and the sectarian lines that are being further sharpened by the Arab Spring, I think the relation with Iran has become much more complicated, especially for the external leadership of Hamas, which does not have this kind of stable control over population and territory, and has to be more responsive to external pressure, especially from the Gulf states and from the Muslim Brotherhood. And to some extent, the relation with Iran, by the way, it's becoming, in a sense, softened or easier to deal with because Hamas, ever since it took over Gaza, has developed its own sources of income. And to some extent, some of the financial aid that's coming from Iran is not as central to the financial survival of the organization as it was maybe a couple of years ago. In terms of Cairo and what happened in Cairo, I do believe that there was a sense that, initially maybe a sense that this is an opportunity and finally things have moved our way, but reality hit quite early on. And I think there was a realization that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, as it was elsewhere, is at the moment more concerned with domestic stuff. Figuring out where they're going to fit, figuring out how they're going to play with the internal Egyptian scene, and did not want the issue of Hamas and Palestine at this moment to be a burden, whether domestic terms or in terms of the attempts of the Muslim Brotherhood to build relations with the West. The last thing that they wanted, they knew this is going to be a tense relation anyways, the last thing that they wanted was getting phone calls from Washington, why are you housing these guys who are involved in terrorism? So there was this complicated, tense relation with Egypt. And finally, and I would say that the way the Arab Spring affected Hamas, at least in the immediate term, the external leadership is much more sensitive and vulnerable to external pressure. Because they do not have a base, because they need to find a base to operate in, because they have no certain control on territory and personnel. So they have to be, Mishal has to be more responsive to what's coming from Egypt, what's coming from Doha, from elsewhere. Those in Gaza, to a large extent, are a bit shielded. There is more stability there, and they can withstand the pressure for a longer time now. Not strategically, not for on the long haul, but in terms of the at least short and medium term, I believe we will see more influence and more impact on the external leadership by the Arab Spring than we would see on the internal leadership.
Mark, what about the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia? Are they players in this evolution?
You've asked a question I don't want to answer. Yes, obviously they are. But let me start by, I always try to search for a metaphor for understanding things, and usually historical, but in this case not. When I was growing up in Wisconsin, one of the really interesting things that I would see was every spring was the melting ice on the Wisconsin River. Now, you go to the Wisconsin River in January, it's frozen absolutely solid, 16 feet thick. Even so, in parts of it, you can see there's stuff going on underneath. There are fish underneath, the river is flowing underneath, but everything is totally, absolutely frozen. You look at the Cold War, everything was frozen. International relations were frozen, movements were frozen, political parties were frozen, relations between states were frozen. Everyone was watching as the United States and the Soviet Union danced. But everything was frozen. And it took 20 years for the unfreezing of the kind of the Cold War to reach the Middle East. But once the river starts to thaw, it thaws everywhere, and it thaws really quickly. And what you think is going to happen never seems to happen. So here was the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt at the time of the thaw, at the time of Tahrir. We thought we're finally having an opportunity to do what we planned for 40 or 50 years. And what really happens is at the same time there's a thaw in Egyptian society, there's a thaw inside the Muslim Brotherhood. So not only is there a clamor for empowerment inside of Egyptian society, there's clamor inside of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this happened with every movement and political party in the region. Tahrir Square just didn't happen in Cairo. It happened inside of Hamas, inside of Hezbollah, inside of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the change that I saw coming, and that I talked to Hamas about over the last several years, was the real deep generational change, the clamor for transparency that you saw inside of these movements, even inside of movements that you thought were so ideologically deeply rooted, frozen. We're not like Hezbollah. And the Hamas leadership has had to deal with this, not just with Saudi Arabia or Qatar, and not just with the SCAF, or not just with its international relations, but with its membership. The 35 and under, 40 and under, BlackBerry carrying, iPhone carrying, younger people who want change, and this has been true across the board in all of these movements. And Hamas has had to react to its membership on a number of issues, on reconciliation of Palestinian society, on more transparency in voting inside of these organizations, on economic representation. Where's my Toyota? Kind of views. And Hamas has had to be very adept, not to get caught on kind of the ice flows, but to reflect this change at the same time that they're dealing with much more what we consider international foreign policy straightforward issues. You know, what's our relationship with the United States? What's our relationship with the SCAF? Now they've had to reflect the changes inside of their movements. And I think that this is what we're seeing inside of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Muslim Brotherhood, is an attempt to mediate a real desire for more openness with what appears to be ostensibly and initially we've won. Well, they've won, but now they have to manage real politics inside of their own movement where they didn't. It's so much easier for these organizations to be strong and to impose discipline when they're dealing with a dictatorship that's oppressive. Now that that's over to a large degree, they've really had to start to move. In Hamas in particular, the kind of spectrum, political spectrum that I focus on is what my two colleagues have mentioned, is the outside leadership has attempted to deal, because they're where they are, they've had to deal with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and changes in the SCAF, where the Gaza movement really hasn't had to do that. They've had to reflect on the changes inside of Gaza society, but they have a place where they can be. So we've seen real splits, I think, ideologically deep splits within Hamas, no use papering them over, and they don't, between the Hania Gaza wing of the party, which is much more Islamic, as it turns out, than we thought it was, and the Damascus wing, which is much less Islamist and ostensibly much more accommodationist. And a new emerging, I think it's newly emerging, kind of center strain in the organization that remains Islamist, willing to wink at political accommodation, and that's represented by Musa al-Marzouk. So if you take a look at Abu Marzouk's statements recently and really study them and try to go back and find out where they came from, I think Abu Marzouk reflects a very strong central position that is derived from the 2006 prisoners document, which is not a recognition of Israel, but an agreement that Hamas would accept a Palestinian state within the 67 borders. Not a recognition of Israel, but 67 borders. A very nice central position which seems to satisfy a more modern, less Islamist wing of the party, and while winking at the resistance as represented by the let's say the Hania wing. Let me just, before I close that section of this, there was a real discomfort I sensed on the part of the Damascus leadership with its relationship with Iran over a period of several years, which they would only, after several hours of discussion, say, well, yeah, Tehran was the only address for them and the last address for them. They would much rather have derived, in my view, they would have much preferred to derive their financial backing from somebody else other than Iran. But Iran was there. And Iran wasn't a warm and fuzzy relationship. Iran promised, what, $73 million, ended up saying, here's 59. They always kept them on a string. There was some resentments inside of Hamas about that. So, and there was a pulling away during the Syrian uprising. There was a pulling away this last summer. In July and August, when there were real intense discussions between the Hamas external leadership and the Assad regime about what Hamas could or couldn't do, and it was very clear then that the obstacle to an understanding where Hamas would kind of pull back from Assad, the obstacle to that happening was Iran. So in February, when Hania came through Doha on his way to Tehran and met with Khalid Mashal, and these two have a competition that goes back 2 decades, Mashal said, it's a bad idea to go to Tehran right now. It's a bad idea. And he went anyway. And there was real controversy inside the organization whether that was the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do. Hania denounced reconciliation, wanted Hamas to be part of the resistance, the continued resistance movement, the axis of resistance, which it's not clear to me it actually exists anymore. And Khalid Mashal's view, which is, we have to work on reconciliation. We're much closer here to what Abbas is saying than you believe. And that disagreement over what reconciliation means, what the strategy of the movement should be, its relationship with the axis of resistance is now being played out inside of Hamas in these elections. The Shura Council elections last week, 2 weeks ago in Gaza, in which Khalid Mashal's current got an itchy close majority. And the elections which are taking place even this week in determining who the new membership of the political bureau would be, and the outcome of that could be a Mashal squeaky close win, or perhaps a compromise, a much more centrist emergence under Abu Marzouk. It's yet to be determined. Doesn't answer the question.
Let me ask any of you about the role of the participation of the influence of the Palestinian constituencies in the West Bank and Gaza for both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, for Fatah. Where do they stand? And how do they view the unity initiative? And are the leaderships of Hamas and Fatah responding to them as well? Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, and before I answer this, just a comment on Mark, and actually more of a question. I am not sure, and I don't know Hamas as well as you do, but I'm not sure how ideological the split is. It seems to me to be much more power-based. And I remember a few years ago with, for example, the prisoners document, where Hania and the Gaza crowd were actually very interested in moving it because their political interest was at that point, and Mishal and the external leadership were against it. So I'm not quite sure how ideological this split is and how power-based it is. I tend to be more cynical, and I think it's more around power. But this is really a question that I would like to, I think we don't have the answer to. And the second component is the military wing, which we haven't really talked about, which we always tend to think of it as a disciplined, apolitical wing, or at least often it's portrayed that way. I don't believe that's the case, and I think that they have a very strong voice in where the organization is going to be moving, whether externally or in terms of reconciliation. In terms of reconciliation, and even before I start addressing your question, I would just take a step back and examine the concept of reconciliation. We often, when we talk about reconciliation, first thing that comes to mind is a national unity government, which is one component of reconciliation. And I suspect it's the easiest component of reconciliation simply because in Palestinian traditional or political tradition, governments were never really empowered. I mean, with the exception of Fayyad's government and possibly Abbas's short-lived government. Traditionally, the governments were not where the center of power lies. And I think in that regard, this is the weakest link in that chain. But if you look at the other components of reconciliation, elections, which frankly I see no interest whether by Hamas or Fatah on. The issue of security unification, which is simply asking both sides to give up their security assets. And again, I see no appetite or interest or any possibility of that anytime soon. If you look at the issue of the PLO, which is really about the platform of the Fatah and of Hamas, I see no real interest in reaching a deal. I see an interest maybe by Hamas to engage in the process, but not in a deal. So in that sense, as we talk about reconciliation, I mean, it's important to talk about the issue of a government, but I don't think it represents reconciliation as we would like to see it. In terms of the Palestinian constituency, the short answer is not really that relevant, unfortunately. The longer answer is the Palestinian constituency, as the Palestinians were trying to figure out how to respond to the Arab Spring and to come up with the Palestinian Spring and what to organize and mobilize around. They were in a dilemma. The first one was, do you have a spring against the occupation or against your own governments? It's a complicated one. Then, if you want to have a spring against your own government, do you have it against the PA? And in this way work for the interest of Hamas, or do you have it against Hamas and work for the interest of the PA? It was very complicated. So, the one message that everyone seemed to agree on is the public wants to end the division. In the same way that in Egypt the public wants to the downfall of the regime, in Palestine it's the Sha'b Yurud Inhal al-Qisam. So ending the reconciliation, ending the division became the organizing principle around which Palestinian activism, for whatever it's worth for the time being, has been organized around. The response by the leaderships, whether in Hamas, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank, has been, on the one hand, in the West Bank you allow them to demonstrate but you don't respond. In Gaza it was a bit harsher and there was a clampdown on these demonstrations, but at the end of the day, both sides felt that there is some pressure, so they engaged in this theatrics of reconciliation. You have a process. I mean, to use the metaphor they use on the peace process, you do have a process of reconciliation, but there will be no reconciliation anytime soon, as long as the parties can survive without it. So far, I see what happened in Cairo and what happened in Doha and all of that as just attempts to kind of throw enough venting for the public to say that we're trying to do it. And in the meantime, what you continue seeing, both parties, the age-old positioning to blame the other side. We see it continuing. We see maybe whenever the top leaders meet, a toning down of the rhetoric, but give it a week or two and we're back to the same old rhetoric. I just do not see the interest. Now, this is for the time being. What we're starting to see more and more among the Palestinians is a greater degree of frustration. On the one hand, at least when it comes to the peace process and it comes to diplomacy, there's a sense that that's leading nowhere, and whether it's the UN bid or whether it's some of these other moves that have been made are losing their traction and losing interest and starting to deflate. And the issue of reconciliation, people have given up on it. And if you follow some of the commentary that you read on Palestinian newspapers and websites and what have you, and even a recent poll, there is a high degree of the public blaming both parties for this reconciliation. This could, in the medium term, contribute to a situation where you will have stronger public pressure, where the sides might have to actually respond to with not only process but with results. But we're not quite there yet. And I suspect that both Hamas and Fatah will do their best at the time being to drag it on. But to conclude, I mean, I would just repeat that even if these reconciliation talks were to succeed, they will succeed in one component of reconciliation, and that's the government. But I just do not see the other components I just do not see the political interest of any of the players right now to get into a deep reconciliation about the other more meaningful components of the process.
Just add a few, I don't disagree at all on what Ghaith said on reconciliation. I just want to pick up on 2 points my colleagues made. First, I think Mark is absolutely right to look at this as I don't know that it applies as much to Hezbollah, but there certainly is a huge number of questions that the Islamist movement in general in the region is facing because it has finally achieved what it's wanted to achieve. And with power comes peril, and in particular for movements that, as Mark put it, have thrived in a tete-a-tete with authoritarian regimes in which the main attributes of patience, secrecy, opacity were what was needed. And the Muslim Brotherhood did very well. It's now facing all kinds of challenges, particularly in Egypt, but not just in Egypt, because it has to answer questions, because it has to be more open, because the currency is not discipline only, but electoral support, open politics. And I think those questions are now going to, as I said, at the time when they finally reach the zenith of their power, they're going to be facing far more problems than they did beforehand. And that's going to have an impact on Hamas, not only because Hamas is one of them, and Hamas has already dealt with a lot of these problems since it started governing in Gaza, but because Hamas reflects the tensions of the parent organization. Where I'm less, I sort of share some of Ghaith's questions about what Mark said is on the ideological nature of the division. The reason I say this is I think over the years I've heard, and Mark was not one of them, but I've heard so many officials and others say, well, the hard line is in Damascus, and the soft line is in Gaza. And then, when it's Shalit, yes, the soft line is in Gaza, but the hard line is in Damascus. When it's relations with Egypt, it's another thing. When it's reconciliation, it's something else. The old saying that where you stand depends on where you sit, I think, has a lot of truth to it in this case. I'm not sure who is softer or harsher. I mean, for example, to say that Haniya is more willing to, he went to Iran against the views of Mashal, but Haniya came out faster and for logical reasons against the Syrian regime, which was closer to Iran. So I think it's a very complicated situation. I think what is true, to repeat what I was saying earlier, I think we agree on this, is that there is a sharpening of some of these divisions. Much more open about it. They're much more personal about it. I mean, they speak about each other in ways that remind you of a Republican primary debate. And but it's quite striking. So they won't hide it anymore. Now, I think I would never. I think there's two extremes. I think it's all ideology, which, as I just said, I think would be a simplification. But I think it's also always a mistake, particularly with ideological movements, to dismiss what they're saying as purely self-interest. I think there is a real debate going on right now. It was most acute after the Doha Agreement, which, frankly, most Hamas members that I know of didn't understand. They didn't understand the reason behind Khalid Mashal's concessions. There may be very good reasons, but it brought to the surface these questions about, are we going to be just another version of Fatah, basically accepting that we're going to give up on violent resistance, that we're going to accept Israel's existence in the border of 67, that we're going to accept negotiations. What then will distinguish us from Fatah? And I think there was tactical differences, but there's also, as I said, a real challenge that Hamas faces. It's faced for a long time. It's not born with the Arab Spring. It's faced it for a long time. It's more acute now because it faces the choices, because the region is moving, because international actors are moving, because there's a prospect now more than ever before of, if not direct, indirect engagement with the West. The West is speaking to everyone Hamas is dealing with. It's speaking to the Muslim Brotherhood, embracing it. It's speaking to Turkey. It's speaking to Qatar. It's speaking to others. If you're in Hamas, you think my turn can't be very far behind, and so that does raise pointed questions about what has not been answered so far. I mean, I think, as both Mark and Ghaith said, they've given answers that could satisfy everyone. We're, yes, 67, but that's not the end of the game. So yeah, we accepted a state in the borders of 67. It doesn't mean that 10 years from now we're going to ask for more. Sure, popular resistance, but it's not at the exclusion of other forms of resistance. Yes, we'll let Abu Mazen negotiate, but he's not going to achieve anything, and in any event, we're not going to accept it if it violates our principles. So it has been a sort of a dance, which, as I said, I think Fatah has been as guilty of it as anyone else, and the U.S. has been perhaps guiltiest of all of trying to say things without taking sharp positions. And I think it's going to be harder for Hamas to get away with it, and I think that's part of the reason why they're engaged in, and as Mark said, in the elections now. My assumption is that the elections are not, as Mark said, I think they're not going to give us a clear answer. I think it's going to be more of a compromise between different people and different views. But I think it's going to be, as I say, harder for them to sort of be an acrobat and have one foot in each on each side.
Speaking of public opinion in the West Bank and Gaza, ideology and power, would any of you like to comment on what history has taught us about the Palestinian public, Gazans and West Bankers? Are they people who are disposed to a religiously oriented governance? Are there choices between the Fatah and Hamas programs based on the need for good governance, accountability, and keeping the schools open and the hospitals running? Looking back into history, what's your thought on that?
My sense is, the Palestinian public is, in terms of religion, I mean, Palestinians are socially conservative, religious public, you see that, but on the other hand, they are not, if you wish, extreme in the way that they apply this. And we've seen this in particular in Gaza, with Hamas governing. There were a number of trial balloons to impose certain harsh Islamic practices, and they were basically pushed back. And but for Hamas, it's very difficult, because once you're in power as a religious organization, you have people trying to bypass you on the right, and you have to always keep on looking at your right flag. And that explains to a large extent why we see a very strong crackdown on organizations which are trying to sound more Islamic than Hamas. But to a large extent, I suspect that trying to impose too strict an Islamic system on Palestine just wouldn't work. I mean, if you look at Fatah, it's a secular organization, but it's a very socially conservative organization, and its leaders are. So I just do not see that the Palestinian vote for Hamas is religiously oriented. And I suspect that the rise of the Islamic, political Islam in the region is not purely ideologically, religiously driven. If I were to interpret the victory of Hamas back in the elections, it is more about governance. And it's more about the failure to deliver by Fatah and by the PLO. And this is, at the end of the day, what will determine, I think, any future election. If you look at the polling today, you will see that Hamas's popularity in the West Bank is much higher than its popularity in Gaza, where the Gaza public actually has to deal with some of the issues that Rob mentioned. And it doesn't matter who you blame at the end of the day. If you're not getting electricity by the end of every day, you will blame your government. Irrespective of there's a siege, there is no siege, it's the Egyptians, it's that. So that's on that regard. It would be interesting to see if there were to be elections today, because Hamas's strongest suit in the previous election was anti-corruption. I think, as Rob mentioned, Hamas in governing Gaza has been guilty with many of the same issues, whether it is bad governance, whether it is corruption, whether it is human rights violations, etc., etc. So, but again, this is right now an academic question, because I just do not see the possibility of an election anytime soon.
I conducted an experiment in December, longer ago than that. I was in a car on the way to Damascus, a Hamas car, and the driver was very hardcore Hamas, and I said to him, I would like to join the Hamas movement, what do I need to do? And he said, well, you need to be a Muslim. And I said, well, I can do that. Well, what else? Do I have to stop drinking? He said, yes. I said, what about smoking? And I mean, it was a much more serious discussion than my anecdotal, and his back was up. Well, you should think about this. And I said, no, I'm very interested. What do you need to do to be a member of Hamas? And he laid it out very specifically, and it was very clear, and it was being, not only a Muslim, but a good Muslim, and following a good life within certain principles. Had nothing to do with politics at all. So then he dropped me off in Damascus and had a meeting with the leadership, and I said, by the way, what do I need to do to become a member of Hamas? Smiles all around in the room. And I said, do I need to be a Muslim? And these guys were members of the political bureau. There was a certain discomfort, and they said, why are you asking us this question? I said, because in their ticket in 2006, there were members who ran on the Hamas ticket of change and reform who were not Muslims, who were not male, who smoked cigarettes, including this woman who ran for the Palestinian legislature in Hamas in Hebron, and I'm just wondering. And the answer from the Damascus set was, we would like to be a little bit more inclusive than that. We would like to base our political movement on good governance principles, and on transparency, and on service to our people. And within those definitions, smoking has nothing to do with it. You get very different answers across the movement depending on the ideological bent. Like, people criticize me for saying the divisions are ideological, but to a certain extent, Hamas members' view of how dedicated their movement is to the principles of Islam is very important, because everything seems to flow from that, including reconciliation and how they view Israel. So if you talk to the Damascus leadership, they have a very clear vision of what their strategy should be on the peace process, and that is to wait, and wait, and to wait, because things are going on inside of Israel that are important, that need to be discussed, that need to be taken advantage of in very particular ways, and the answer is not always shoot them and don't recognize them, but much more nuanced, maneuverable, kind of adaptable political point of view. It's not true for everyone across. I'm not distinguishing this, not defining Hamas as this, but for other people in the movement, that's absolutely out the window. Resistance is the answer always, everywhere. So this is a very diverse movement with a lot of different points of view. One has yet to emerge, and it is, if it's not obvious, if it wasn't obvious before, it ought to be obvious now. There's no way to view this movement as everywhere, all the same, absolutely intransigent. This is a movement in transition, much like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or, and I would claim, Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Someone said in this fascinating discussion that maybe it's all academic. Maybe it's all academic, given the fact that what we used to call the peace process is in cold storage, and the huge importance of resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a lever that will oblige other parties to reconsider and change themselves. So let's talk about the bottom line for the United States. The United States, as you know, has said that there will be no participation if the U.S. gets its way of Hamas in the Palestinian government unless it meets the four conditions, the so-called quartet conditions: recognition of Israel, abandonment of violence, recognition of all past agreements. What's the fourth? Three.
Add one?
No. Rob, why don't we start with you? What about the conditions? Should the U.S. stick with these conditions? Are they immutable? They certainly are not traditional in diplomatic history to demand the commitments before the negotiations begin. How does the U.S. get out of this trap, if indeed that's what it is, or are these matters of principle that we should stick to? If the Hamas somehow find a way to satisfy the U.S., Europeans, and the State of Israel, and the negotiations would begin. Of course, we're far from there yet, but at the outset, let me ask you, what should the U.S. do as it considers how to get over this impasse and get back into the business of influencing peace?
First, I think there's so many obstacles to a genuine, productive peace process, and Hamas is the issue of how to deal with Hamas is only one of many, many. So even if you got over that one, I think you still would be stuck. But I think it's important to clarify the debate. It's become very confused. I mean, the issue is not negotiating with Hamas. You don't negotiate with the Democratic Party or with the Republican Party. You negotiate with the U.S. administration. The issue is not even necessarily the Palestinian government, because you negotiate not with the Palestinian government, but with the PLO. The issue is not whether the U.S. is prepared to fund or necessary to fund. It's also, is it prepared to engage with, and it's not even is it prepared necessarily about whether the U.S. is prepared to engage with directly, or whether it's prepared to engage with indirectly and to have sort of different kinds of third parties that would be dealing with Hamas. So I think it's become a question: should the U.S. engage Hamas, which people immediately think, should the president start sitting down or one of his envoys start sitting down with a Hamas official? Number one, as I said, that's not the question. Number two, it's not going to happen. So, it's not in the foreseeable future. So I think we should put that to the side. I think the real question is, what do people want from Hamas, and how are they going to achieve it? I think for Hamas, the question is, what do they want from the international community, and how do they want to achieve it for themselves? But focusing on the U.S., I start from a point of view which is not, it's sort of pretty basic, which is, I think, whether it's from an American, Palestinian, or Israeli point of view, if you want to have a viable, meaningful peace process, you better have a unified Palestinian movement, which doesn't mean a monolithic Palestinian movement. It doesn't necessarily even mean a reconciled government, but it means that you need to have some coherent entity, pluralistic, divided even, just as we are, just as Israel is in spades, but with which you could deal authoritatively, which you don't have today. You have a movement that's in crisis. It's not clear what it represents. It's not clear what the PLO represents. It's not clear what the PA represents. It's not sure what the government in Gaza represents. So you have a crisis of legitimacy and of representation. And I think that's been extraordinarily harmful for the Palestinians, beyond anyone else. I think it's been harmful for others who at least claim to be in pursuit of peace. I don't think it's been good for Israel in the sense of those Israelis who want a two-state solution. I don't think it's been good for the U.S. So I start from that point, which is there needs to be, and as Ghaith said, I'm not optimistic about it happening anytime soon, but there needs to be a restitching of the stitching together of the Palestinian national movement. Now, when it comes to the U.S., my thinking now, and again, I'm well aware that it's very hard to move, and particularly on issues like this. So I think we are in a stage where, as I said earlier, the U.S. has revisited at lightning speed. Lightning speed its approach toward the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, I think it went from refusing to engage to embracing too quickly, without really thinking and without stopping in between. I don't think it's particularly convincing when an entity that you said you wanted to have very little to do with, because it succeeds, suddenly you embrace it. I think it hurts you with your old allies who you seem to have abandoned. I don't think it helps you with the new ones who see you as opportunistic. So I don't think that's been particularly well done, even though I've always argued in favor of engagement with Islamist movements. But so I think you have now a number of actors that the U.S. is dealing with daily and wants to deal with daily, Muslim Brotherhood in particular. They may be an interesting channel for exploring what can be done with Hamas, and again, and vice versa. As I said, I think it's a two-way street. I don't expect things to happen right away, in particular because, as Ghaith said, the division is going to be with us for some time. But I think that's not, and I assume that's something that you could start doing relatively soon, which is trying to explore what it is where could Hamas move. Now, you ask about the quartet conditions. Just to, I thought they were a bad idea to begin with. Both substantively and procedurally. Procedurally, as you said, you don't want to put a complete bar to engagement before an entity espouses or changes its positions without having the kind of engagement it would take to convince them to change their positions. And people bring up other analogies. I can't think of a case where suddenly a movement decides, okay, I'm going to change everything I said before simply for the sake of talking to you. But I also think that the conditions themselves substantively were not well thought through. And there were other ways of getting, and smarter ways to trying to move towards the same objective. If you ask a member of Hamas, and I assume not just Hamas, I think many Fatah members are sympathetic, you need to renounce violence. They have an easy comeback. Israel hasn't renounced violence, so why should one party unilaterally renounce it? So, we can go back and forth, what kind of violence, etc., but that's an easy answer that plays very well, I assume, with not just Hamas constituency. Recognize Israel. Well, when has Israel recognized a Palestinian state? Again, I'm not saying that Hamas wants Israel to recognize a Palestinian state on the border of 67, but it's a very easy, logical answer. We'll recognize you when you recognize us. You haven't recognized us, well, why should we even discuss it? And accepting all past agreements at a time when both parties are flouting the agreements right and left, is basically very, I mean, there's still Oslo remaining, but in terms of implementation on the ground, the violations galore. Easy answer. When Israel respects Oslo and past agreements, we'll think about it. So it didn't seem to me to be definitely done. If the objective was truly to get Hamas to think about it, to have an internal debate, there can't be an internal debate when on those three issues there's a clear answer. We're not going to renounce violence, we're not going to recognize Israel, and we're not going to accept all past agreements. So that's why you get these ambivalent answers, but because the questions are said so starkly, you don't get anywhere. My suspicion, I'll end with this, is that I know a number of European countries that are prepared to say, well, let's sort of massage those and say, well, ceasefire rather than a complete renunciation of violence. A putative recognition of the state of Israel, the same way the Arab Peace Initiative says, which is once there's a solution, we could accept a state of Israel. Maybe you could move in that direction. And rather than focus on past agreements, say that if there's an agreement that's reached between Israel and the Palestinians, it's endorsed in a referendum. Hamas would abide by it. I think there are more nuanced, sophisticated ways of getting there, but it starts from the main question. What do people really want from Hamas? What is it that they're looking for? Do they accept the premise that I started off with, which is a unified Palestinian entity movement is better than a divided one? And then we can start talking seriously about what kind of engagements, because what we've had so far, I think, has been rather futile.
Before I ask Mark and Ghaith to comment, what if the United States, the international community, offered an escape route for Hamas if it was one to overcome the obstacle of the conditions? What if, combined with that change in U.S. policy, somehow the U.S. and its allies could come up with a policy that would give all Palestinians some new and palpable hope that maybe there was a way to negotiate a two-state agreement, and the U.S. would be behind it. Would that oblige Hamas to change its policies, and would it oblige the Fatah to undertake real reconciliation?
When you talk about engagement with the United States with Hamas leadership now, it brings wry smiles. 5 years ago, they were quite anxious, I think, to talk. And they would have welcomed an opening to the United States and embraced it and had long discussions with the United States. It's not clear whether they would have led anywhere. But now it brings kind of a wry smile, and it's because of what Rob pointed out. The United States was absolutely opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood. No, never, ever. And now, not only, the closer that the Muslim Brotherhood has come to actually governing, amazingly, the more moderate we think they've become. And Hamas knows this very well. If there were a reconciliation and a vote tomorrow, and the Palestinian in Gaza and West Bank, and there was a majority, as there should be, in the Hamas and the Palestinian legislature, and a Palestinian president, the president who was Hamas, or a Palestinian prime minister Hamas, or at least a majority party, I don't think the United States would, faced with that reality, insist, especially if its Fatah partners said, we are in charge of governing the West Bank and Gaza, and this is the best way for us to do it. What are we going to say? We're not going to cut off funding, because we haven't cut off funding. And what does that do? What kind of leverage do we really gain? I think that Hamas's strategy here is to just wait out the United States, because it seems to me that that's a strategy that's worked for the Muslim Brotherhood, whom we would never, ever talk to because they were so extreme. And now we say, this is very interesting. We have emerging moderate Islamist parties in the region. And I think Hamas sees that. So if you were to dangle an offer to Hamas as part of a unity government, let's say, I think that Hamas would answer as they ought to answer, in which Fatah has answered, which is, bring the Israelis to the table. When you can do that, we'll have a debate over here about whether to do it, because you have not been able to bring Israel to the table. You're not going to be able to bring Israel to the table because you're not willing to pay the political price to do it. That's what's at issue here, not engaging Hamas or a two-state solution or anything. show that you can bring Israel to the table for real negotiations, and will come.
Surprising to myself, I actually tend to agree with both of my colleagues on some of these issues. In terms of negotiations, if you look at negotiations today as the two parties really trying to reach a deal, then the issue of Hamas becomes relevant. As I look at negotiations today, I look at the Palestinians and the Israelis being driven primarily by domestic considerations rather than they are by foreign policy considerations. Is it good for me politically in my next election cycle or not? And in that regard, whether or not Hamas participation in a unity government will collapse or allow negotiations becomes really secondary. If Bibi today wants to engage in negotiations because they might be politically useful for him, there'll be a way around a Hamas government, whether by finding a national unity government that has vague platform or no platform, or by saying that we're negotiating with the PLO, not the PA. And if you don't want to have negotiations for domestic reasons, you'll find a million other reasons not to engage in negotiations. So that to me is not really, that's a very much of a red herring. In terms of the, and oh, by the way, in terms of the escape route that you mentioned, Phil, I actually believe that this is really the test. When there's a moment, when there is a belief that a process is leading to something real, that's when some of these questions will have to be answered. But right now, if I were to go and engage in a debate with a Hamas person saying that negotiation is the way to move forward, what do I have to present for my case? And in that regard, all of this now is not really politically operative. In terms of the conditions, I think actually what you said, Mark, to me illustrates why the US should not move towards rescinding these conditions anytime soon. We cannot be seen as being too weak, we cannot be seen as being too susceptible to these sudden changes. Our leverage decreases. We have already seen that. Right now, I think if we were to suddenly, for no particular reason, drop these conditions, the message to Hamas, it will definitely skew the ongoing interesting dynamic within Hamas, but it will be another sign of US not projecting its power. And that's irrespective of whether or not we agreed with the conditions to start with. Once they are a tenet of your foreign policy, to drop them for no particular reason, for no payback is not, in my view, the wisest of moves. But one bit where I think the Hamas participation and the conditions, what have you, is quite relevant. Not in negotiations, not in peace process, but in domestic Palestinian affairs. I actually do believe that what the Palestinian government in the West Bank under Fayyad has been doing is very significant in many regards, whether in domestic Palestinian terms or in terms of relations with Israel. And I also do believe that Hamas and Fatah, for their own reasons, would like to get rid of Fayyad. Fatah is not particularly happy with the anti-corruption work that's been done, and Hamas has not been happy with the security and some of the other stuff that's been done. And I do believe that Hamas is entering the Palestinian government will affect the Palestinians in that regard, will definitely change the relations with Israel, that in the West Bank so far things have been stable on the ground from a security point of view, would also definitely reverse some of the reforms that we have seen in the Palestinian Authority, because I don't see either Hamas nor Fatah particularly interested in maintaining and continuing reform.
Thank you all for that conversation. Let's turn to the audience and invite questions. If you could identify yourselves and make your question brief. Joe Monfield.
Thank you. I'm Joe Monfield. This is a slightly exotic question, but for Rob, but perhaps anyone else who has an opinion. How do you assess Musa Abu Marzouk's decision to choose the Jewish Daily Forward as its messenger and to give two full days to Larry Kohler Esses to do quite a remarkable interview and send a message to the Jewish American intelligentsia? How do you assess that?
Maybe my colleagues have a better sense. I figure that those things often happen because of personal contact. Somebody told him that this is a great forum. He didn't do his own. I doubt he did his own. first investigation, again, I could stand corrected. It happens, and I've seen it happen in other cases, where there's one channel and somebody knows somebody who convinces him that if he really wants to have to expand his visibility on the American scene and on the Jewish scene, this is the way to do it. There may be another explanation, but I think he probably felt that he wanted to send a message, and the coincidence of the person who told him that this was one where he could get a lot of visibility would do it. But maybe somebody knows more about that.
I don't know more, and I'm always hesitant to believe that there is strategy behind any move by any Palestinian actor, Hamas or Fatah. But I would say the following. In analysis, it looks to me like a part of an electioneering. In the same way that you're saying, one of you said that he's trying to present himself as the middle road. So you talk to the forward, but you send extremely tough messages, much tougher than what he would actually... What we're used to hearing from the Hamas people, and so I think it's part of that whole image making. In terms of the message to the Jewish intelligentsia, I'm not quite sure how successful that was. When the substance of what he said was basically goes beyond some of the things that we've started taking for granted from Hamas. People like saying that we accept a deal if it's ratified by referendum, etc., etc. So I think in terms of that component, it was mixed bag, but I'm not sure that was his primary objective.
Saeed?
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. My name is Saeed Erkat from a Quds Daily newspaper. And seeing how Hamas is very pragmatic, in many ways, really, today's Hamas looks like yesterday's Fatah was moving in that direction. So I want to ask the flip question of Phil's question. So looking at how rapidly they abandoned, let's say, Syria and Iran, why not really adopt those three conditions placed by the quartet? I mean, I'm not suggesting that they do. I'm saying, do you see them adopting that real soon and seeing what Arafat did, let's say, in 1989? Thank you.
No, and the main reason is because Arafat did it, and then the core argument for them is we're not going to undress the way Fatah did and have the same thing. I think they might try, as I said, they might try to find indirect ways of getting there. So, as I had said, sometimes we hear dissonant voices. I think they would like to sort of say, well, we're more or less there. The Egyptians have said, look, the Doha, whatever Mashal and Abbas agreed, it's very close. It's the quartet conditions. They're not going to. They can't do it. I think they would have a domestic problem on their hands. And there, Mark is right. They have a constituency that would say, "What was this about? All of a sudden, we're giving up everything we held true to." But I think it really also would cut against a principle which I've heard now every time, which is sort of the anything but Fatah principle. We can't do what they've done, even if some people think we are.
I would add that, we've never been able to answer the question which they've asked, and which they've asked me any number of times, almost every time I meet them. And then what? And then you impose a settlement freeze on Israel? Well, maybe not. And then you bring Israel to the table to discuss what? And then what? So we do all of this. And then what? And I haven't gotten a clear answer on that from any quartet member or any member of this government. It's always been, well, in order for negotiations to go forward and for them to be included, they have to do this. Okay, and then what? And then there's not a clear answer. So the chances of them doing it, I think, are zero, especially the renunciation of violence. Why would they do that, considering what they view as the daily absolute price they pay in the occupation?
If I may just add my more cynical twist to it again, which is, in addition to all the things that you mentioned, it's also a very convenient club to batter Fatah with every time that you're in a political contest. Now, I suspect in the long term, not now, if they emerge as the sole uncontested leader of the Palestinian movement, they'll be more flexible. But right now, since they are in competition with other players, it makes no political sense whatsoever for them to move forward, especially that, as I think Mark mentioned, the price that will come with it is not at the moment really that dear.
Professor Smith.
Charles Smith, University of Arizona. We're talking about electioneering, which certainly applied to this country as well. After all, Eric Cantor said in the fall of 2010, he assured Netanyahu Congress would protect Israel against the administration and working for the settlement freeze and things of that sort. So my question has to do with electioneering. Isn't the United States, whatever administration, are possibly paralyzed to a certain degree about what it can do, and this is suggested. But then how much faith does either Hamas or Fatah have in the United States and its ability to oversee or push some of these processes? And what about the Europeans, the other members of the quartet? How much faith do they have in the United States dominating this issue? And is there any tendency here to think about rethinking the quartet and having the European community or several states at least move in a different direction?
I don't know how much faith Fatah has in the U.S. I suspect too much. I think there's always this illusion, this myth that the U.S. is suddenly, because it's a second-term president, or because it's seen the light, or because the President of Arabs is suddenly going to do what it hasn't done for decades, and which there's no logical reason to think they would do. And we could debate, the pros and cons. But I think I'm sensing now, as the elections are approaching, renewed hope on the part of the PA, people around the Palestinian president, that a second term Obama is going to be very different, so let's not do anything to rock the boat. My view of this is, if by some miracle it were to happen, that the U.S. would take a dramatically different position, then so be it. Then the Palestinians will be probably very happy. The likelihood is they won't, and therefore better have a strategy that is independent of that. As for alternatives to the quartet, I think Khaled Gindi is here, and he wrote a really remarkable monograph for Brookings in which he both deconstructed the quartet and showed that, and I agree entirely with his conclusion, that it became a least common denominator organization that diluted the independence of entities like the Europeans that might perhaps someday have a different voice, turn the UN into what it really should not be. I mean, the Secretary General, in what capacity is he sitting in a quartet? Is he speaking for the UN membership, which wouldn't agree with virtually anything that comes out of the quartet, or in his own capacity? And I'm not sure what that capacity is. So I think, again, we should think about what are different modes of mediation. Again, Khaled does it very well. We have this report coming out Monday in which we say this is one of the issues that needs to be discussed. I'm not sure that there's a very good answer. One answer I don't think, unfortunately, is the Europeans. For me, the test case of the Europeans were the Bush years. Second, Bush Jr. Here was a president he wasn't monopolizing the peace process, he was sort of evacuating it. He wasn't there. This was a time if the Europeans wanted to do something, when they'd always criticized Americans, or always excluding others. This was a time that they could have done something. They did absolutely nothing, and whatever they did by following the U.S. on issues like the quartet conditions, on issues like the reaction to the 2006 election. So my faith in the Europeans is quite low. I think when you have 27 entities and you've got to bring them all together, and some of them are certainly not prepared to do anything in the least adventurous. Again, I tell the Europeans, the Palestinians, don't hold your breath. Better have a strategy that can succeed regardless of what the U.S. does, and independent of your hopes that the Europeans will finally awake.
I fully agree with what you said in the following sense, that if you want a third-party role, it is the U.S. and no one else. Everyone dislikes the U.S., doesn't trust the U.S., whatever, but everyone ends up coming to the U.S. What you mentioned, Rob, in terms of the Europeans in the Bush years, actually we've seen it more recently with the UN bid, where the Europeans, almost every European official that I've talked to was unhappy with the US position, yet none of them was willing to to fill this vacuum. That could have easily been filled because there were ideas floating in Europe at that time, yet none of them, the bottom line is we will only do it if the US tells us to do it. So if you want a third-party role, it's only the US. Now, yes, you can look at a policy that has no third-party role, a Palestinian strategy, with no reliance on a third-party player. That's a different story. But right now, there is no alternative to the US, and even if there's a sense of an image of a weakened US, which I don't think is based in reality, but definitely there's the image out there. Even with that, I just don't see anyone stepping in to fill that vacuum.
My only addition, will be very short, is that the second significant thing that's happened over the last 3 years in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the most significant thing was the Arab Spring. The second most significant thing that's happened, I don't think we can take our eye off on it, and I think it's almost impossible for me to quantify, is the change of opinion in the United States toward Israel. And it's not on the front page of the Post every day, but it's there and it's tangible, and the Israeli leadership is worried about it. And these kinds of shifts that no one predicts are going to have the most impact. The idea of giving up quartet conditions or negotiating a two-state solution could be all off the table, but the ice is moving, and the ice is moving in Israel too, and between Israel and the United States, and that's significant, I think.
Paul Sham.
Paul Sham, MEI, and the University of Maryland. You've pointed out, I think you're absolutely right, there's no incentive for Hamas to accept the condition. However, I think it's clear from what you say and just in general, it's moderating in certain ways. What price is it paying for doing that, specifically from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which has been its rival since it began, it antedate Hamas. And I thought a few months ago there were some indications that PIJ might get the Iranian franchise if there was real tension between Hamas and Iran. This isn't happening, but what do you see PIJ's role, especially since every once in a while they shoot off a few rockets and embarrass Hamas?
Two comments first on the sort of moderation, a little bit contradictory. I mean, I think there has been to some extent an evolution. I think it's hard to deny it. I think people make too much of it at the same time, because if you go back, a lot of the things that people are now sort of surprised to hear, Hamas leaders have been saying that for some time. I mean, the acceptance of 67, if it's accepted by referendum, Sheikh Yassin said it before he was killed. So I think people sort of, I mean, it's a little bit what Mark is saying, that one discovers moderation when one wants to see it, and then one views it as radical when conditions change. So I think, yes, there's been some evolution, but I wouldn't make too much of it. It's been a sort of a constant thread, and there's always caveats to their evolution. So that's the first point. The price they've had to pay, I think they've had to pay a price, partly because I think mainly because of what we were discussing earlier, which is the compromises they've made for the sake of governing in Gaza. Sometimes compromises, sometimes worse than that. I mean, cracking down on people who are firing rockets, it becomes hard to say that you're a resistance movement. And the one irony about them refusing to renounce violence is that they're not engaging in violence. In fact, they're trying to crack down on those who are. So they do find themselves in the shoes of Fatah in that respect. They are, those who want a more purist Islamist government in Gaza are also alienated. So I think it's, in terms of Gaza, they're finding it much harder to sort of toe the line. And there have been some defections to Salafi groups, to others, maybe to PIJ, to some extent from the military wing. There's been some talk of that. The one thing about PIJ, and yet it is closer to Iran than Hamas is, I think that's a fact, but PIJ is not a grassroots political movement that could really compete with Hamas in that sense. So it's a rival, and it's an annoyance, irritant in terms of the fact that it launches rockets, and they always have to negotiate with it the conditions for it stopping to launch rockets. And the most recent barrage might well have been, and I don't know this, but it may well have been connected to Iran and Syria's desire to create some trouble. So I think they have to deal with that, but they're not really an electoral political rival to Hamas. But I think there's no doubt, and it's been true since Hamas took over Gaza, that they've had to manage a more difficult domestic constituency, people who are dissatisfied from the right, people who are dissatisfied because of the human rights violations, because of the corruption, and people who simply ask what does Hamas stand for? If they're going to simply sort of do what our former rulers were doing, what was the point? And there was a Hamas preacher who was expelled from the movement for saying not long ago that Hamas had lost 30 to 40% of its popularity in Gaza. I don't know how we came up with that number, but I think it shows both the fact that they are declining. I think they've made the point they lose much more in Gaza than in the West Bank, and that they don't want it to be known.
Professor Zartman?
Israel has negotiated with Hamas. Hamas has negotiated with Israel over Shalit, over ceasefires, and so on. Isn't that recognition? You can't negotiate with somebody without recognizing them.
I mean, there's plenty of precedent for that to make it not fall within that category. Israel negotiated with the PLO prisoner releases in the 80s and in the 70s and what have you. This is always seen, at least for political purposes, it's not seen as recognition. It's not part of that. It's just basically an operational feed level accounted for. It doesn't come with political, neither side tries to add any political baggage to it.
Just to add one thing, it's one thing to recognize the existence of Israel. I mean, Hamas leaders will say, of course it exists, and of course we deal with it, but we don't recognize its right to exist in peace and security the same way the PLO did at the time of the Oslo Agreement. It's sort of longer term. Are we prepared to live with it in the future and to accept that it has legitimate borders, or are we accepting the fact that it exists? And yes, you deal with your enemy that exists. You shoot at it sometimes. It's one form of negotiating. You capture prisoners, you release prisoners, you change prisoners. I mean, that's not. I think that's not what the Israelis are looking for when they talk about recognition.
This is a kind of political meme in the United States. Well, we don't talk to Hamas because Israel doesn't talk to Hamas, and we're with Israel. We're strategic allies of Israel. Israel talks to Hamas every single day in the prisons. But it's become very useful for people who are supporters of Israel in the United States, hardcore supporters of the United States. We stand with Israel because we don't talk to Hamas. So it's become a very useful political mechanism. It doesn't even matter whether it's true or not. It's a litmus test of your loyalty to a very strategic and important relationship. Sadly.
I want to thank our panelists for a very rich and fascinating discussion. I want to thank all of you for coming, and thanks to the Middle East Institute for sponsoring this event.